Thank you, everyone, for coming to this webinar. My name is Brahm. It's a real pleasure to be here with all of you. I am the founder of Empath Ventures. Empath Ventures is an early stage VC fund that invests in psychedelic medicine companies. And with me is my partner, Sam. Got a few goals for this webinar. We're going to be talking about investment opportunities in psychedelic medicine because that is what our fund does. So just to be clear, what we're not going to be talking about is cannabis. We're not going to be talking about underground or recreational use of psychedelics. We're not going to be talking about some of the state-by-state decriminalization efforts around psychedelics. Those are all exciting topics, but those are for another day. Today, we're just focused exclusively on talking about investing in businesses that are focused on nationwide medicalization of psychedelics, or in other words, the pharmaceuticalization and FDA approval of psychedelic substances. The way we're going to do this webinar is we are going to spend about the first 30 minutes with Sam and myself giving a presentation, and then we're going to reserve the second 30 minutes for a Q&A. And the Q&A is really important because if there was no Q&A, this might as well just be a podcast and there'd be no point in having an audience. So we really want to invite and encourage you to ask questions. The way we're going to do the questions is, we have a lot of people, so we're not going to go around and unmute people and have them come on camera and ask them. We want to ask that if you have a question, you just enter it into the chat in as plain English as you can. And during the second 30 minutes of the webinar, we will go through the chat and we will answer as many questions as you can. Because we only have 30 minutes for our initial presentation, we're going to keep it broad and high level. So the questions is where we can really get into the depth and the details. So feel free to ask questions about the science, the business, the financing, the regulations, et cetera. But yes, encouraging Q&A is a big thing here that I want to emphasize. There are three things that I want you to take away from this webinar. The first is that there's a tremendous amount of human impact and economic upside potential in solving the mental health crisis, and that psychedelics are well positioned to be one of the solutions there. The second thing I want people to have a good understanding of is the different types of business models in the psychedelic medicine space. And the third thing is that I want you to leave here with the sense that investing in psychedelic medicine is actually a lot less crazy and fringe than you might initially think, and that there's actually a ton of activity already happening in the space now. And of course, I guess a bonus would be if you get excited enough about the space to invest yourself, maybe even through our fund. So we're going to go ahead and get started here. Please keep yourselves on mute, and Sam and I are going to go ahead and start our presentation here. All right, so like I mentioned, we think there's a tremendous amount of human impact and upside potential in solving the mental health crisis. So I'm going to talk about the mental health crisis very briefly here. As I always joke, the statistics around mental health are pretty depressing. About a quarter of adults globally suffer from some sort of mental health issue, whether that's depression or anxiety. About 15% are struggling with some sort of substance abuse issue. And this isn't just a problem for, human well-being. This actually has economic impact as well. The World Health Organization estimates that every year the global economy loses about $1 trillion in lost productivity just because of depression and anxiety in the workforce. So we have this big problem. And the current treatments that we have are really not helping much. So about a third of people that take antidepressants are still depressed. About 50% of people that go through some sort of substance abuse rehab program, whether that's pharmacological or social program, they end up relapsing within a year. And since the year 2000 in the United States, there's been an almost 200% increase in deaths of despair. Deaths of despair is a catch-all term that the CDC uses for things like suicides and drug and alcohol-related deaths. So we have this big problem. We have these treatments that, by the way, we spend about $280 billion a year on trying to treat this stuff just in the US. And things just seem to be getting worse because the current treatments that we're spending all this money on are not working. And so if someone came along with a better solution, you could help a lot of people and reroute some of those hundreds of billions of dollars that we're spending without much results, not without much to show for it, towards this new solution. And as I'm sure you've guessed, because you're on this webinar, we think that at least one of those solutions could be psychedelic medicine. So we're living in this era now where there have been a number of academic studies and studies sponsored by companies showing that psychedelics are very powerful tools to treat mental health disorders. One of the studies that everyone likes to talk about is the most recent MAP study, which showed that About 2/3 of people that tried MDMA therapy for PTSD no longer met the criteria for PTSD after a few sessions. PTSD is notoriously hard to treat, so a 67% efficacy rate is pretty remarkable. And this is just one of many studies. We're in this sort of like psychedelic renaissance era when it comes to psychedelic research, and there are more and more studies being published every day. So what does this mean for the end user, for the consumer, for the patient? What sort of world do we live in a few years if these trends continue? Well, we already have some psychedelic drugs available for patients. In 2019, the FDA approved a variation of ketamine as an antidepressant. MDMA is very likely to be approved by the FDA in early 2024. We see that based on where clinical trials of psilocybin, the active ingredient in magic mushrooms are, we think that psilocybin is going to be approved by the FDA probably in 2025. And then in 2026 and beyond, that's when the floodgates open and all of the other psychedelics that you may have heard about, maybe LSD, DMT, ayahuasca, et cetera, that's when those drugs, as well as a whole universe of yet to be discovered psychedelic drugs, will be getting closer and closer to clinical use. So that's where we see this stuff going. But what sort of businesses are required to get us there? Is there any precedent for this sort of thing? And what types of financing is required, and what types of financing and business activity is already taking place in this space? So to talk about that, Sam is going to come up and give us a bit of a walkthrough. So over to you, Sam.
Thanks, Bram. Hey, everyone. Thanks for making it to our webinar. I'll be walking you through the psychedelic ecosystem. In this ecosystem, there exist companies operating using many business models, but ultimately they all focus on either getting drugs approved by the FDA, so falling into this general pharmaceutical category, or helping patients access them once they're approved. And for all intents and purposes, we'll call this non-pharmaceutical. It's important to recognize, though, that when we use the term psychedelic companies, we're referring to a theme that's being applied to existing, well-established business models. Psychedelic companies that we look at and invest in aren't a part of some strange, segregated, opportunistic industry. These are companies that are generally categorized across 4 subverticals, which we'll dive into now. And so if we look at the pharmaceutical side, we often see companies that are in this drug development or drug discovery category. Companies that are doing drug development are trying to get existing psychedelics approved by the FDA and are often looking at approval for psychiatric disorders. Examples of this include MDMA and psilocybin, which is the active ingredient in magic mushrooms. And because these classical psychedelics have long histories of human use and data supporting their therapeutic efficacy and general safety for many psychiatric disorders, this significantly de-risks their clinical development. The downside with drug development companies, though, is that intellectual property protection is much weaker because the molecules are already being used and have existed for a while. So companies may try to do this fancy thing where they change a tiny part of the molecule or package it in a delivery system to strengthen their IP, which can work sometimes. But we believe that most of the low-hanging fruit in this category of drug development has already been picked. When we move on to drug discovery companies, these are really companies that are looking to invent new and improved psychedelic compounds. Many of the more popular psychedelic drugs were invented by humans at some point in history, either intentionally or unintentionally. Things like MDMA, LSD, and ketamine fall into this category. Companies in this category of drug discovery are using modern techniques and science to invent the next generation of psychedelics. Some examples of why an organization would want to try and tweak a psychedelic or make a new psychedelic include increasing the safety profile for specific populations, whether it be the elderly or more vulnerable populations, inducing different subjective effects, so changing the type of experience that one has, reducing hallucinogenic properties, although we're not sure why anyone would want to reduce hallucinogenic properties. All jokes aside, there's also some companies that are trying to develop drugs for use outside of psychiatry as well. So, there's potential to develop new psychedelics that have efficacy for neurological disorders and neurodegenerative disease. The downside of companies in this drug discovery category is that new molecules take a lot of time and money to get approval in what we call this drug development life cycle, which I'll come back to later. The drug development lifecycle typically just begins with drug discovery and ends with the FDA saying that it's okay to sell this drug to a prescribed patient population. The upside of drug discovery is that new drugs have the strongest IP moat. They have something called composition of matter protection. Now, moving on to the non-pharmaceutical side, companies have been created to support the existing framework for psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy. Some of these companies are already generating revenue given the legal use of ketamine-assisted psychotherapy, but all of these companies are also positioned to generate revenue and value once some of the psychedelics that are soon to be approved that Bram mentioned start being prescribed. So on the care delivery side, we have examples of companies that are trying to facilitate, psychedelic therapy in clinics or via telehealth. Care delivery is especially important for psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy because patients are required to prep with psychologists and other professionals leading up to their dosing event. And, they also must have integration sessions post-dosing to maximize the therapeutic benefit of the drug. When it comes to some of the more powerful interventions that are soon to be approved, in-person clinics and spaces are highly important. It's been shown that your mindset and setting, or the more commonly referred to set and setting, have a significant impact on your experience. So clinics in this ecosystem really emphasize the atmosphere and surroundings that are honestly a part of the psychedelic therapeutic experience as well. And finally, in this accessories and ancillary category, we've seen software products that are contributing to the infrastructure that clinics will use for care delivery. There's also service-based insurance companies and employee benefit providers that focus on the administrative and operational element of reimbursement. So quite a few different business models, but they generally fall into those categories. So hopefully you're starting to get a feel for this ecosystem and the several industries that are embedded within it. And for a quick visual aid, we included this industry map that we made earlier this year. This includes a bunch of companies that already exist in the space, but not all of them. As you can see, there's a very active startup ecosystem. We're expecting quite a few new drugs to get to the approval pathway or approval process in the coming years, the majority of which we expect to come from the efforts of these early stage companies shown here. Okay, so I just told you about how there are all these companies trying to get psychedelics approved by the FDA, and that might sound a little bit out there, but here are some data points that support the idea that maybe this isn't so crazy. It's no secret that psychedelics, and even the word itself, has a highly stigmatized history due to historical and cultural contexts. What not a lot of people really know is that there's already a history of stigmatized drugs, not only getting approved, but also being extremely commercially successful once they're approved. I'm going to walk you through some of these stigmatized drugs. In 2018, a company called GW Pharma had their drug Epidiolex approved for epilepsy, which led to a $7.2 billion acquisition in 2021. This drug is on track to do $750 million in revenue this year. Epidiolex is none other than CBD, which is one of the two major components in cannabis. Just a year later, the large institutional pharmaceutical company Johnson & Johnson had Spravato approved for depression, which is on track to do $500 million in revenue this year. Spravato is ketamine, which we consider to be a psychedelic. And so this is a very important point. Psychedelics have already been approved and are generating revenue, and they've been approved by large pharmaceutical entities. When we move to the next year, Jazz Pharmaceuticals had Xywav, one of their drugs approved for narcolepsy, which is on track to do $1.8 billion in revenue this year. Xywav is actually made up of an active pharmaceutical ingredient called GHB, which some of you may or may not know as a dangerous party drug. It's important to recognize that although there's stigma surrounding these compounds, there's also immense therapeutic utility in very specific situations. And so in this context, getting MDMA or another psychedelic approved by the FDA doesn't actually seem so crazy. In addition to all of this past June, the FDA actually released a proposed guidance that is intended to support drug developers with tips and expectations regarding psychedelic drug development. Furthermore, MDMA and psilocybin received breakthrough designation by the FDA. I'm not sure if you're familiar with that, but very quickly, this just means that these ongoing trials are given special attention by the FDA because the psychedelics show immense potential in terms of safety and efficacy. So I mentioned this thing called the drug development life cycle a little earlier. And in general, when it comes to taking a drug through discovery, development, and into clinical trials in new areas of medicine, it's typically early stage companies that begin this process. So these therapeutic development startups, some of which you saw on that industry map, need to continue raising capital to get their assets to a critical value inflection point where big pharma can eventually take over via an acquisition or a co-development partnership. This inflection point is usually post-phase 2 studies, but it can actually happen earlier if the assets have a lot of clinical and commercial potential, and these are considered special cases. In terms of who's backing these psychedelic companies, though, including many of the ones you saw in our industry map, you'd be quite surprised to learn that institutional grade funds are involved. Some of these firms, like Citadel, Deerfield, Founders Fund, RA Capital, and BVF, are some of the funds that have invested in backed psychedelic companies, invested in. These are not small fringe VC funds, but legacy institutional players that manage billions for conservative pension funds and endowments. Since 2017, $2.5 billion have been invested in psychedelic companies. So it should be clear by now that psychedelics isn't an industry, but a theme applied to exemplar business models. It should be clear that there's strong commercial precedent for stigmatized drugs to become blockbuster products. And it should be clear that the investing environment is established and is made up of reputable sources of capital. In addition to all of this, just this year, key M&A activity with big pharma companies has signaled immense growth and establishment from an institutional legitimacy perspective. What's really exciting about this is that these examples are with drug discovery companies that have not yet entered clinical trials. So if you remember that special case I was just alluding to, these are examples of special cases. From this, we can infer that these big pharma companies clearly see immense value in investing in psychedelic organizations. Just really quickly to highlight two examples, Silo, which is one of Empath's portfolio companies, was the first private entity to sign a partnership deal regarding developing psychiatric therapies with a big pharmaceutical company called Daiichi Sankyo. Daiichi is one of the top 30 global pharmaceutical companies by market cap. So this is very exciting. There have been other deals in the space, but more recently, one of the bigger announcements was that another big pharmaceutical Japanese company called Otsuka acquired Mindset Pharma, which is another drug discovery company in the space. So we're all very excited about this, and we're happy to answer any questions. But before then, I'm going to hand it back to Brahm to talk about the specifics of our fund.
Thanks, Samantha, for the overview. So yeah, just want to give you all a bit more depth on what Empath actually is and how we ended up starting it. So Empath is a small early stage VC fund that invests in psychedelic medicine and next generation mental health tech. We're raising 10 million for our first fund. We've closed about half of that so far. Since we started the fund, we've been pitched by over 500 startups. And so we've seen a lot of different business models out there and have a pretty good understanding of the space just due to all that exposure. And we've made 14 investments to date. Some of our limited partners include Jim O'Shaughnessy, Mark Andreessen, and Chris Dixon from Andreessen Horowitz. Our fund has been featured in publications like the Wall Street Journal. We've been invited to host panels at South by Southwest and that sort of thing. So we're definitely out there and in the mix in the psychedelics world. Just for a bit more background on myself and Samantha. So I came from the hedge fund world. I've had a long-standing interest in psychedelics since my college years, but the first decade of my career was defined by portfolio management work at some pretty large hedge funds based in Los Angeles. In 2020, there was, many of you know, there was this big explosion of psychedelic companies that started IPOing on the Canadian stock exchanges. And I became kind of fascinated with this because as a hedge fund guy who was interested in psychedelics, it was really crazy that there were psychedelic stocks out there. This happened to coincide with me deciding that I didn't really want to work in the hedge fund space anymore. And I ended up leaving my hedge fund job in 2020. And I started just going down, spending all my free time going down this psychedelic capital rabbit hole. And I started a podcast where I interviewed a lot of people that were starting psychedelic companies, that were investing in psychedelic companies. And that podcast got pretty popular and it gave me a lot of deal flow. And so I found myself in the mix of all these investing opportunities. And I said, maybe I should lean on my previous investing experience and this place that I find myself in now and start a fund. So that is what I did. I set up the infrastructure for Empath at the end of 2021, started raising and deploying capital. I met Sam about a year later and we started working together. And then she joined as partner in, I believe, October of last year. I'll let Sam give a quick intro to herself also and talk about her background.
Thanks. So my academic training and degrees are in chemistry and psychoactive pharmaceutical development for the brain. So either psychiatry or neurodegenerative disease. And in addition to working full-time at Empath, I am the biotech lead at Canada's largest accelerator called Mars Discovery District. But previously, a lot of the work that I've done, and really most of my career, has centered around working with early stage biotech on the operational side. So I have experience running drug discovery programs, helping with strategy, stuff like that. But the one thing that's been pretty consistent and core to my entire career has been my interest in trying to find solutions for complex brain disease. And so, of course, psychedelics, I believe, is a tool that really can be used to do that, not just in psychiatry, but beyond in the coming years. Really great to meet you all.
Yeah, so between my finance and investing background and Samantha's scientific background, we make a pretty good team, I think. I just want to talk a little bit more about some of the investments that we've made. I'm not going to go through all the 14 investments that we've made because that would take forever, but Sam very elegantly split the industry into 4 different pillars during her presentation. And I'm going to talk about one of our portfolio companies from each of those pillars, just so you can get a better understanding of what businesses in those pillars might look like and the types of investing that we're doing. So on the drug development side of things, remember, this is companies that are just taking existing psychedelic drugs and trying to get them approved. We're investors in MAPS Public Benefit Corporation. They are leading the charge of getting MDMA approved as a therapy for post-traumatic stress disorder. They finished their final phase 3 trials, and all signs point to them getting FDA approval in early 2024. So we're very excited to be backers of MAPS, which we think is going to be first to market with MDMA. On the drug discovery side of things, we backed a company called Silo, which is trying to discover entirely new psychedelic drugs that have never before been discovered. And one of the characteristics that they're trying to optimize for is reduced and maybe even entirely eliminated hallucinogenic effect without compromising on the therapeutic efficacy of the psychedelic drug. Now, it might seem a little bit crazy, like why would you want to reduce the hallucinogenic effect of psychedelics? I certainly think that there are some good arguments for it. Not that this is what everyone should do, or not saying that no one should ever have a psychedelic experience, but when you go out and you survey people that have never done psychedelics before and you ask them, why haven't you done psychedelics? Something like 70% of people say they're afraid of hallucinating or having a bad trip. So there's kind of the stigma of having a hallucination that keeps a lot of people from trying psychedelics. And when you're thinking about maybe using psychedelics for something like repairing a traumatic brain injury, or maybe treating or slowing the progression of a neurodegenerative disease like Alzheimer's or dementia, maybe you don't need the trip for that. Maybe the trip is more important when it comes to things like depression or trauma, et cetera. So I think there is a good case for trying to do what Silo's doing, which is reducing or eliminating the hallucinogenic effect associated with psychedelics. On the care delivery side of things, these are businesses, of course, that are trying to get psychedelic medicine to patients. We invested in a set of ibogaine clinics down in Mexico called Beyond. Beyond specializes in using a drug called ibogaine, which some of you may have heard of, to help treat opiate addiction. Ibogaine is a very, very powerful psychedelic drug that comes from a tree that's native to Africa. It's a very long and intense trip. It lasts something like 36 hours. So very few people do it recreationally, but it has an interesting side effect of eliminating opiate cravings in people that are addicted to things like heroin or fentanyl, et cetera. And so Beyond is basically operating ibogaine or psychedelic assisted rehab centers, if that makes sense. They're doing this in Mexico because that's where laws permit them to do this. But as ibogaine gets approval in the US, they'll be able to operate in the US as well. And on the accessories and ancillary side of things, there's a company that we're in the process of investing in. I don't want to say the name yet because the investment hasn't actually gone through yet. But basically, what this company is going to do is be an employee benefit provider for psychedelic medicine. In other words, right now, if you're a big employer like Google or Microsoft or someone, and you believe that psychedelic medicine might be a useful tool for your employees have access to in order to improve their mental health, it's not clear how you actually get that psychedelic therapy to your employees. So this company that we're in the process of investing in is going to be the employee benefit administrator, basically, for psychedelic therapy. So they will go to big companies and say, hey, do you want your employees to be able to access ketamine? sign up with us and we'll take care of all the details, make sure it happens in a safe, effective, and cost-efficient way. So that's an example of a company in like the accessories category where they're not directly involved in the research or the care itself, but they're important in administering all the details that go into walking a patient through the life cycle. Sometimes people ask like what VCs actually do. Like, do we just write checks and then sit on the beach all day? The answer is no. We try to be as helpful as we can to our portfolio companies. So once we have invested, we spend a lot of time working with them and trying to help them with their needs. And while we're still a young fund, we have done some things that I'm pretty proud of. So Samantha mentioned during her piece that there's a company called Silo we invested in that just had a sponsored research agreement with Daiichi Sankyo get publicized, which is very exciting. That's kind of the first privately held psychedelics company to have a sponsored research agreement with a big pharma. The whole reason that happened is because we introduced them to that big pharma. So we sort of catalyzed that deal, which is really helping them in their current fundraising efforts. We have a pretty big network of well-credentialed professionals that are excited about psychedelics and want to work in this space. So we have this talent network that our portfolio companies are able to access. And we've helped source 3 director level positions for our employee companies through our network, for our portfolio companies through our network. And because we do things like this and we get featured in all these media publications, we've been able to coordinate 7 high profile media features for our companies, which is really exciting. In terms of who our fund's backed by, it's, you know, some of the pioneers in venture capital, social entrepreneurship, and impact investing. I mentioned their names earlier, but Jim O'Shaughnessy is one of our backers. He's a Wall Street legend. Mark Andreessen and Chris Dixon from Andreessen Horowitz are personal backers of the fund. And recently, Blake McCoskey, who was the founder of Tom's Shoes and has dedicated something like $100 million of his personal money to psychedelic philanthropy, is also a backer of the fund. So I'm going to stop there, and I think we're going to move into the Q&A portion. I just want to recap really quick and hope, touch on those takeaways that I mentioned at the beginning. So I think we talked about the human impact and financial upside potential of psychedelic medicine. Sam did a great job of walking us through the business models in psychedelic medicine. And hopefully between Sam's presentation and my piece, you were left with the impression that investing in psychedelic medicine is really not that fringe. Some of the biggest investors on the planet are getting involved with this stuff. Billions of dollars have already been allocated. Big pharma has already made acquisitions of psychedelic startups. So, companies like Johnson & Johnson are generating $500 million a year from selling ketamine nasal spray as an antidepressant. So, we're long past the couple of guys doing acid in their basement and talking about how it would be cool if this was a business. And we're actually at the point where big money is getting involved, and this stuff is getting very, very close to being mainstream mental health treatments. So thank you so much for listening. We're going to go to the Q&A now. Please keep yourselves on mute. And remember, we're going to do the questions through the chat. Feel free to ask any questions about anything related to psychedelic medicine. And I think Sam and I will go ahead and start going through that chat right now. So let's see what's going on in the chat. I'm going to scroll back to the beginning and start in the order that the questions were asked. I like this one. Where is everyone joining from? I'm in Los Angeles and Samantha's in Toronto. This is a good question. How many patients are typically required for clinical trials, phase 1 through 3? Sam, do you want to speak to that? I can speak to it too, but.
I mean, so it really just depends on the patient population that you're going after, but typically you can have a couple of hundred or even less in your phase 1 studies. Phase 1 studies are really just to make sure that, it's safe to take in humans. You're not really measuring some kind of output or endpoint for clinical efficacy. And usually phase 1s are generally and traditionally used to figure out what the dosing is going to look like. Phase 2 and 3, obviously it's an increasing order. So you really want to look at larger patient populations in phase 2. Can be anywhere from 400 to 1,000, give or take. That's not a hard and fast range. There's variations of this for sure. And when you get to phase 3, you typically want to, generate some statistical power to your readout. So you need to get into the thousands of patients zone. Sometimes it's smaller than that if it's a rare disease. But typically, the more patient data that you generate as a sponsor of an application, the stronger case you can make for safety and efficacy. Although when a lot of drugs are approved, they enter into this like phase 4 area called pharmacovigilance, which is basically just trying to track adverse events in the general population. But it really varies. And there's also a lot of new, interesting, innovative trial designs that try to combine phases of the trials nowadays, which, is a whole other discussion, but that's typically the range.
The next question here is that it says, not sure if this was addressed on the call already, but can you talk about what the Otsuka and Mindset deal means for investors in the space? So Sam did touch on that during her presentation, but I just want to add a little bit, few more comments here. So like Sam mentioned, this big Japanese pharmaceutical company called Otsuka acquired a psychedelic startup called Mindset just a few weeks ago. And this is really exciting because this is the first time that a big pharma company has acquired a psychedelic startup. Otsuka is a really big name. They're one of the largest pharmaceutical companies in the world. And when we are out here raising the fund and we talk to investors, smart investors know that, love them or hate them, big pharma is critical to getting drugs across the finish line. And so one of the common questions we get from smart investors is, to what extent is big pharma involved? Is big pharma interested? Is, what's sort of the deal with big pharma? And up until recently, my answer always kind of had to be vague. It was, well, some companies have done partnerships. Some big pharma companies have written small checks into companies, and some of the big pharma companies have had meetings with our portfolio companies. But now I can say, actually, big pharma is very involved, and there have actually been acquisitions where big pharma bought out these psychedelic startups. So that it's a really big milestone. I think it's hard to overstate how important it is. Hopefully, the first of many. Okay, the next question from Mateo. I keep hearing that there's a lack of infrastructure, whether it's therapists, insurance coverage, et cetera, to allow for a successful delivery once the compounds are approved by the FDA. How important is it for companies to appear on the infrastructure side? And do you see them as a key vertical to invest in? Yeah, so in each of those 4 pillars that Sam talked about, half of those pillars are on the pharma side, half of them are not on the pharma side. So far, we've invested pretty evenly, both in dollar terms and in number of company terms on both sides. The infrastructure is probably going to be critical. I think that it makes sense that there's a lot more investing activity just in the space on the pharma side for now, because until there are drugs approved, the infrastructure is just going to be sitting there not doing much. So it makes sense that people are kind of starting with the pharma side. And I think that the infrastructure will be built as the demand is demonstrated. So we see it as a very critical piece, and it is something that we're investing in. Christian asks, Brahm, do you and Samantha believe that there will be unique distressed assets, IP, lab space, et cetera, for acquisition in 2024? Yes, not only do we believe it, but we have seen it. So back in the good old days of zero interest rates and free money, there were a lot of companies that got funded without much diligence and without much thought to what their longevity would be, because lots of people thought that money would keep falling from the sky. And now there are lots of companies that are near the end of their runway and are selling either their entire cells or their assets for pennies on the dollar. This is not just happening in the psychedelic space. I think this is a bigger macro trend that you see across most of the startup landscape. So we've seen it happen. We've had a few of our better capitalized companies ask us to keep an eye out for acquisition opportunities. So yes, absolutely. This is happening. Can you talk a bit about picks and shovels and early stage opportunities versus technical, scientific, and new drug discovery investments? Yeah, this kind of goes back to just is it the infrastructure or is it the drugs? And the answer is that it's both. This stuff really does, I think, create a bit of a flywheel. Like, as there are more therapeutic options available, there's going to be more infrastructure required. And as more infrastructure is available, that incentivizes drug makers to, make more drugs. And so I think that the two sides will sort of feed off of each other. And I would say that the challenge with the infrastructure is that it's hard to really build infrastructure when you ultimately don't know what the FDA is going to require in terms of like safety protocols around these drugs. So the FDA usually has what they call REMS protocols, which stands for risks. And of course, now I'm blanking on the name like an idiot. Sam, can you remind, do you know?
Risk evaluation and mitigation strategies.
Yeah. So once the FDA approves a drug, they set forth these REMS requirements that talk about like what sort of facility can these drugs be administered in? Are people allowed to take them home? Do you have to have a doctor on site, or is a nurse practitioner okay? These kinds of things. And these rules really dictate what sort of infrastructure has to be built. And because we're sort of in the pre-FDA approval era, we don't know what those requirements are going to be yet. So it's hard to really go all out and build infrastructure in most cases. All right, the next question is, many/most molecules fail to make it past phase 3 for FDA approval. And in general, it costs an average of $1 billion. What are your thoughts on being able to minimize risk there? Or do you think psychedelics being novel will have less risk due to being new early on? Yeah, most drugs do fail to make it through to FDA approval. The interesting thing about psychedelics is that psychedelics is kind of like, it's kind of like there's this cheat code that psychedelics have, which is that there are hundreds of thousands of academic studies and human experience reports that suggest that these things actually work for mental health disorders. This is pretty rare in the drug development work. Usually it's, some scientists at a university that invent this new molecule that they think cures cancer in rats. And then it's this whole process of like spending billions of dollars to show that it actually does so in humans, which, oftentimes it doesn't. Psychedelics are different because we have this long history of human use, and we have a really good idea that this stuff works. It's really less a matter of like figuring out if it works and more a matter of just collecting the data in the proper format so that the FDA can see that it works. So I think that psychedelics have a better chance than a lot of drugs at being able to demonstrate efficacy and getting approved. All right, let's see. Ariana says, few questions. What is your thesis around what drives a successful drug development company in the psychedelic space? We can start with that one. Sam, do you want to give your answer first, and then I can give mine?
Yeah, certainly. So we kind of talked about companies that fall into this drug development or drug discovery subvertical. And I think it's important to note that when it comes to the drug development companies right now that are using these existing psychedelic compounds, I do think that the criteria for what will drive a successful program for those companies is different than what would drive a successful drug discovery program, where there's new psychedelics being developed. But overall, I think in terms of just the type of due diligence that we do, I think, of course, you need the right team. You also need the proper scientific rationale, the IP, and also the operational capability. And usually, we look for companies that have all four of those. I won't say any specific companies, but I'm of the personal opinion that some of the companies that listed publicly very early on didn't have all four of those, which is why they kind of were shaken out as time has gone on. But the companies that are standing typically have the expertise on their team to really help with the development. And usually this is expertise from big pharmaceutical companies. In terms of just generally what drives a successful drug development company, I really think that even at the early stages in drug discovery, the groups that are thinking about reimbursement, a target product profile, and just their patient population and clinical trial design very early on have very good foresight into how they're going to need to conduct their lead optimization, which is a part of drug discovery. And so beginning with the end in mind, I know, although it sounds obvious, is something that isn't always the case because there are different ways to get drugs quickly approved. And so in the long run, we try to look for companies that have the capability to sustain themselves with really impactful innovation. In other words, truly, develop a very powerful therapeutic and not just something that's going to compete with, another example of a drug that's very similar to theirs. So that's personally what I think. Brahm, I'm not sure if you have any other comments there.
Yeah, you always talk about how if the better you understand the mechanism of action, the better you can set up the trials. And a lot of these companies that are lower quality companies don't seem to pay a lot of attention to that. They just say, hey, psilocybin seems to work well in humans. Now we're just going to do this little tweak to psilocybin so that we can say it's a new drug. They're not actually bothering to understand what is this tweak actually doing mechanism of action wise? How might these new properties impact its therapeutic efficacy, et cetera?
Yeah.
So
and to be clear, that does work sometimes, but the FDA doesn't require sponsors to be like, this is my proposed mechanism of action, which is why a lot of these drugs that adopt that strategy do get approved. However, if you have a stronger understanding of what's driving this interaction, you're more likely to develop a more powerful drug that can stand out among competition throughout the years. And so that's kind of why we say that.
And one thing that I'll add to that, just to tie it back to our own investing, is that we've only invested in one company that's really focused on making entirely new psychedelics, and that's the company Silo I mentioned. The reason that we were excited about Silo is because their presentation wasn't like we're tweaking DMT or we're tweaking psilocybin. Their presentation was, we have actually, through this like massive computational drug screening campaign, we've identified drugs that hit psychedelic targets, but that don't resemble any known psychedelics. These are like entirely novel chemical scaffolds that happen to interact with the same receptors that psychedelics do. And what that meant for us was that, first of all, this is likely actually going to be very unique IP that's protectable. Second, because it has novel chemical scaffolds, there's probably going to be potentially like some different mechanisms of action and some different ways that this interacts with the receptors, which might result in a different like subjective effect. And so looking for that real newness and that real innovation is the thing that gets us excited. But the second part of Ariana's question was something that you touched on, Sam. She asks, what is the target product profile for the ideal psychedelic therapeutic to get you excited to invest?
Yeah, I mean, I think this could be a very personal answer. It really depends on what you're interested in. I think very generally, a differentiated target product profile is interesting. What I mean by that is there's quite a few companies that are developing drugs that have the same route of administration, the same duration of action, same, patient population. But generally, if I'm seeing a target product profile that is in the neurodegenerative space, I'm interested, but we have to do due diligence in order to determine if it's viable.
Maybe just for the people that aren't experienced in pharma, could you just give us a quick explanation of what a target product profile is?
Yeah. So whenever some organization, no matter how early the stage you should be thinking about what is this TPP, target product profile. And so even if you are intending to sell your company before you get your drug approved, the reason you need to think about a target product profile is because you need to design and optimize the drug across many different phases of the drug development life cycle for a very specific population. So a really great example of this is if you're targeting an elderly population, that's something you would have to consider immensely in terms of the route administration. The way the body interacts with the drug will be different depending on the age of the person. So things like demographic, route of administration, dosing regimen, and other elements of that patient experience need to be discussed and taken into account. When you're at the early stages of drug discovery, it may seem like, I'm 5, 6, 7, 8, 10 years away from approval. Why do I need to think about this? It's important because those design elements get incorporated into your program then. And over time, your target product profile becomes more detailed, more refined, and more concrete. And so it's really a guiding document when you're developing a drug product, and is really useful in terms of trying to summarize what it is that your drug is going to do for a patient among treating things like the disease, and also the characteristics of the experience.
Yeah, that makes sense. And the next question here, do you need to see a pharma partner, or do you typically see pharma partners getting involved in early stage drug development opportunities? Like, I guess another way to rephrase it is like, when should a big pharma partnership happen?
Yeah. I will quickly give my take. We don't require seeing a pharmaceutical partnership. In fact, we don't expect to see those at the stages that we're investing in. So we're investing usually at the pre-seed, seed stage when it comes to the drug development companies or drug discovery companies. Typically, you do see these partnerships happening around phase 2. So once a company has been able to get phase 2 data, that's when big pharmaceutical companies will come in and have an interest. But there's different M&A trends in different sub-verticals of drug discovery as well. And so, sometimes there are co-development partnerships that happen. Once you hit your IND enabling studies or file an IND, which is an investigative new drug application with the FDA, that's another inflection point that sometimes pharmaceutical companies will come in at and offer a co-development partnership agreement. And these are usually an upfront payment and then milestone payments later on to continue developing this drug when it starts to get expensive with clinical trials. And in exchange, for the co-development fees, obviously the big pharmaceutical company gets royalties from any kind of proceeds from that drug. So no, we don't require it. When we see it, if we see early partnership opportunities, that's fantastic, but it's not something that commonly happens at the early stages of drug discovery companies.
Yeah, it's also worth noting, and this is useful even for people that are like trading some of the public market companies. A partnership is not a binary thing. It can mean a lot of different things. And it's definitely worth taking the time to figure out what the nature of the partnership actually is. We've seen some companies that were preclinical and their slide deck had like 5 partnerships listed on there, and all the partnerships were basically meaningless when you actually took the time to figure out what the partnerships actually meant. So dig into those partnerships for sure. And yeah, what are the most promising indications outside of mental health and addiction? Mental health and addiction are definitely the most promising in the near term. The other areas that we think are interesting are in neurodegenerative disease. So things like Alzheimer's and dementia, potentially in things like chronic pain. There's a lot of discussion around the mind-body connection in pain and how much of chronic pain is psychological versus actually physical. So there's maybe some potential to treat chronic pain using psychedelic-like compounds. But it's important to like recognize that all this stuff is really kind of like hearsay. There's hundreds of thousands of anecdotes of people's mental health being improved by psychedelics. And there's tons and tons of research that demonstrates that mental health is often improved by psychedelics. That data does not really exist for these other things. It's much more theoretical and early stage. So when you talk about these like follow-on indications, you're really moving away from that sort of like long history of human use cheat code that I was talking about that psychedelics have, and moving back towards just kind of traditional pharmaceutical development where you're just starting with a hypothesis and testing it out in animals and then progressing it through the normal pathways. So we're excited about the opportunities there, but it's still very theoretical and far in the future. Can we get a copy of the presentation to share? Yes, this is being recorded and we will upload it. This is a good question. For those unfamiliar with the FDA process and how many patients are required, this is a good read. Okay, that's not a question. That's a link. Okay. If you were to recommend a psychedelic investment media and research resource, what are your top 3? Good question. The top website, so Psychedelic Alpha does a pretty good job of tracking a lot of the developments in the space. You can check out my podcast at brahm.fm. And our friends over at Empath Ventures have a podcast called Business Trip that is pretty good too. Thoughts on the direct-to-consumer psychedelic psilocybin side? I mean, listen, at the moment, there are lots of businesses like that. They're all totally illegal. They're not gray area. They're full-on illegal. A lot of people are making a tremendous amount of money off of them. In many cases, it doesn't seem like the law enforcement agencies really care, but they don't care until they do. And then all of a sudden someone's in prison. So super interesting, happy to be a consumer of them, but not something that we're investing in or looking at in this way. This is a question about a very specific company, about a company called Numinous Wellness. Is it just another Canadian pump and dump? Are you suggesting that Canadian companies are often pump and dumps, sir? Kidding. What about Numinous? Is it just another Canadian pump and dump scheme run by penny stock promoters? Doesn't seem to be any business or operational experience at the company. And there's been nothing but short-term IR/PR decisions made by management since founding. Yeah, I've tracked Numinous. They're a publicly traded psychedelics company that's doing a lot of clinics, not clinical development, but building clinics in the US. All I'll say about Numinous is kind of a point that you already made, which is like, I think in many ways, the quality of the company is like inversely proportional to the number of press releases that they issue. So, people that are actually doing things just do them. They don't necessarily talk about them. So I think, the more press releases that get pushed out and shared on LinkedIn, be wary.
Yeah, I just want to add very generally, not specifically about Numinous, but about some of these self-proclaimed psychedelic companies that I've noticed when a company seems to be confused in terms of which business model they're using to either generate revenue or create value, it's usually not a good sign. And I think this is not exclusive to psychedelics. I think it's a common thing you see with emerging verticals. If it wasn't psychedelics now, it was cannabis a few years ago, maybe it was something else. But when you're trying to do too many things at once, it's an obvious statement, but it's not a good thing. And when I see companies that were originally operating on one business model suddenly doing drug development or drug discovery, it is quite confusing, and it is a flag for me. I'm not sure what color, but it is a flag.
Yeah, probably yellow or red. The next question is, any opinion on the current state of CPG companies positioning for legalization? No super strong opinions there. Just noting that in the United States anyway, these are Schedule 1 controlled substances, meaning that if you're selling them, you are committing a crime that is more serious than selling cocaine or heroin. Those are both Schedule 2. So, even though mushrooms are less harmful than those substances, that's not what the DEA seems to think. So, any companies manufacturing or selling those drugs are breaking the law in a serious way and are putting themselves and their investors, if they have them, at serious risk. So it's funny because mushrooms are so socially acceptable now, at least in places like California, that a lot of people, I've met people that make mushroom bars and products and sell them, and they actually don't know that they're breaking the law. They're like, yeah, it's great that they're decriminalized now, so I can do this. And I'm like, where did you read that they're decriminalized? I'm not, where did you get that idea? They're not. You could easily go to prison. So that aside, that disclaimer aside, in the cannabis space, we did see situations where companies started off basically breaking the law, and then they built this brand in an underground way. And then once the laws changed, they were kind of the dominant player. I think cookies is the prime example in the cannabis space. But we still, even once the laws change, like in California, for example, this isn't something that we would invest in as a fund, because these companies, like cannabis companies in California, they're still breaking federal law, which causes all sorts of problems. It means that they have a hard time getting business insurance. They have very complicated tax consequences. They're taxed on their revenue, not on their profits. And there are very limited exit opportunities. A company that's selling Schedule 1 controlled substances, even if that's legal according to California, that company can't trade on the New York Stock Exchange, et cetera. There's all sorts of problems. So economic upside aside, it's just not something that we look at as a fund. All right, we got about 10 minutes left, so I'm going to try and get through these pretty quickly. Have we done due diligence on any psychedelic education and training companies? No, we haven't. We've seen a few decks come through, but not sure that the market opportunity is big enough for a venture type investment there. What is preventing mass therapeutic adoption when the research is already prevalent for something such as ketamine? The reason ketamine isn't more widely adopted is because most ketamine, with the exception of Johnson & Johnson's Spravato, is just generic ketamine that is being prescribed off-label. Therefore, insurance will not cover it. So you need on-label approval so that insurance can cover it, and that's what will enable mass adoption. Spravato is getting pretty close to mass adoption, by the way. Have you identified a clinical trial CRO that has specialized or done more psychedelic trials than any other? I do know that there's a CRO called Clerkenwell that claims to be like the go-to psychedelic CRO, but I don't know. Sam, are there any in particular that you know about?
I mean, one of the more well-known CROs, Worldwide Clinical Trials, has a presence at all of the psychedelic conferences. I think generally speaking, most CROs are trying to get involved. But yeah, I've also heard that about Clerkenwell as well. They claim to have specialized experience setting up these trials.
Yeah. So Tommaso asks, are the legalization attempts in states like Oregon, Colorado, et cetera, a threat to medicalization of psychedelics through the FDA? Or do you think the fact that the FDA approval is required for things like insurance coverage, is that enough to protect the medical route? Yeah, I think that the legalization attempts in places like Oregon and Colorado, I don't really see it as a threat. I think that the type of experience you'll get through like state level legalization versus medicalization is going to be very, very different. Psychedelics to a lot of people are a pretty scary thing. And I think it's the kind of thing that they're going to want their doctor's input on. You're going to want to be able to go to your doctor and say, hey, I'm curious about psychedelics, or I had a psychedelic experience. And that's only going to be possible when you're accessing it through the medical system. They're probably not going to be able to speak on, non-medical use of a chocolate bar that you bought at a store. And I think that there are still a lot of people that might be more concerned with, purity, medical purity, et cetera. That's not to say that these decriminalization and legalization efforts are bad. I'm big supporters of them. I'm a big fan of ending the war on drugs. And, I'll probably be a participant in that consumer market, but I just don't think that it has to be one or the other. I think different people want different things. And I also think it's worth pointing out that, when you're trying to solve like a serious mental health issue like suicidality or something, that's not something where you're going to want to just buy some mushrooms at a store and like sit in your backyard. I think that's a situation where you want medical professionals involved, and that's where the medical system really comes in. Mateo asks, what role could AI play in psychedelics, if at all? We're already kind of at risk of using too many buzzwords when talking about psychedelics and mental health. So, I think having like AI and psychedelics on our pitch deck would just be like buzzword overkill. I do think that there already are a number of companies using AI in their drug design efforts. By the way, this is not new. This has been going on for a long time, back when AI was called machine learning and statistics. So AI has been used in pharmaceutical drug discovery for a long time. If you're talking about large language models like ChatGPT, if there's any utility, I would say it's more on like the therapist side. Maybe you have therapy apps that use ChatGPT. Maybe you have apps that allow therapists to like capture notes during their session using ChatGPT or something like that. But my personal take on this is that psychedelics is more just like about biology and humans connecting with humans, not necessarily about AI. How is indigenous wisdom coming into psychedelics? Is there a promising direction in developing care solutions with their inclusion? Yeah, so when you're talking about like some of the psychedelics like ayahuasca, those were discovered or invented by groups in South America, and they've kind of been using those for a long time, and they have a lot of knowledge around how these things can be used. Pretty much every company that's working on a psychedelic drug has some plan to either incorporate that sort of knowledge into their final care delivery model. There's always going to be a debate around like what's the appropriate way to compensate those folks for the knowledge that they've contributed to the space. Pretty much every time you go to a psychedelic conference, there's a debate about this, and there are panels about this. So it's definitely an ongoing discussion. But I definitely think that in the case of something like ayahuasca, where it's very clear that it was discovered by indigenous communities down in South America, which one is maybe another story, but it clearly was. I think that respect should be paid to that. I think it becomes a little bit less clear when you're talking about drugs like ketamine or LSD that don't have a history of indigenous use or discovery, et cetera. Looks like we got 2 more questions and we got 2 more minutes. So this is perfect. Are you keeping eyes out for businesses evolving in Oregon and Colorado and hopefully California soon? Yeah, we kind of touched on this earlier. I mean, it's an exciting space. The sad reality is that until the federal law changes, these businesses are going to be operating in a bit of a gray area where it's legal at the state level, but illegal at the federal level. And that means that, for the purposes of our fund, it's just not something that we can touch. So we're paying attention, but not from an investment perspective. Let's see. Another question is around D2C with Amanita muscaria extracts. This is an interesting question that I think points to a broader thing, which is so Amanita muscaria is a mushroom. It's actually the Super Mario mushroom from the game, the red one with the little dots. It's not psychedelic in the sense that it doesn't have the same pharmaceutical mechanism of action that classical psychedelics do, but it does cause an interesting feeling in the body. And Amanita muscaria, it turns out that it's like not even illegal. You can buy them in the US already, but it does have medicinal purposes. It's not psychedelic. And I think this points to like a bigger question around, we know that psychedelics have been used for a long time. We know they have these medical effects. Are there other plants out there that maybe we're just overlooking due to some stigma that might have beneficial effects, whether that's on mental health or just physical health? And so we are starting to broaden our scope away from just things that are considered pure psychedelics and into things like Amanita muscaria, into things like canna, which is sort of like a natural MDMA that's native to South Africa. There's this whole interesting world of like ethnobotanical wisdom that can be applied to the healthcare space. And we're excited to explore it and invest in it. So we're at time now. Thank you guys so much for coming. It was a real pleasure to get to talk with you all today. Thank you so much for the engaged and thoughtful questions. I can stay on for a few more minutes if anyone wants to ask any other questions, but we'll go ahead and upload a recording of this and reach out to all of you via email in the coming days. So again, thanks so much.